Strength Athlete Podcast, episode number 22. For this episode, we have brought back one of our most enjoyed and well-received guests, Michael Tuchscherer. And I'm joined by Eric Bodhorn as well as Bryce Lewis. If you guys all want to say hello.
Hey. Hello.
You too, Mike. You can say hi if you want.
Good day.
Excellent. You don't have to lean in when you're wearing the microphone, but we'll let that one slide.
Oh, you think, huh? That's what you think.
All right. Confirmed he's not using the Apple microphone. Excellent. Now I'm just an asshole. But yeah, so today we're going to talk a little bit about a term called emerging strategies. And I've had a couple conversations with Mike about this. And I know that recently you released something on Powerlifting University that was related to this. And so I'm actually really excited to get into this conversation. A couple of housekeeping items before we get moving forward, though. A quick shout out to the sponsor of the Strength Athlete Podcast. It's going to be SBD USA. They have partnered up with us to give you guys a free shipping code for domestic orders in the US of any size. That coupon code is going to be in all capital letters SBD TSA. Or you can find details of our arrangement at www.sbd-usa.com/TSA. And yeah, use the coupon code, order things. Take care of them because they take care of us and make it possible for us to stay on the air. Additionally, if you are enjoying our show, please make it a point to leave us a review in iTunes. 5 stars obviously would be cool, but we do want to hear your feedback. Go do it. Enjoy. You do that more, we do this more, and everybody goes home happy. Back to the subject at hand. So, emerging strategies. Give us the short breakdown, Mike, before we get into questions and kind of trying to poke holes here.
Yeah, I'll do my best to make it short. I'm not very well practiced at that, so hopefully I don't drag it on too long. But the idea is just we start with this idea of custom training. I think that's really kind of where it starts. This observation that training works differently for different people. We respond to different stimuli in different ways. You can give the same program to 2 different people. It can work for one person, be a disaster for the other. So how do you begin a process of teasing out what is it that works best for you as an individual athlete? Because you can look at things on a big level, and we can extract the general principles. These things are mostly correct most of the time. But if that's not correct for you as an individual person, that's not super useful. If you're a powerlifter, if you're an individual sport athlete, then you want to do the training that moves you forward in the best way possible. And if it's theoretically the best, but not the best for you, that's not very helpful. So kind of with that in mind, how would we go about figuring that out? What's a process that we could use to figure that out? And at least for me, I'll speak for myself, I didn't have that much of a process for a long time. It was mostly, just kind of observations that you would pick up here and there. And, you're just kind of reliant on your own pattern recognition power, But the way that we write training, the way that I wrote training, was following more typical periodization models and things like that you see commonplace in powerlifting. So it would have a block structure and an annual plan, even a multi-year plan in a lot of cases. And you get these complex, intricate cycles within cycles. And oh, by the way, the athlete is not a static organism. They're adapting to the training. They're adapting to outside stimuli. They have the life factors that we talk about so much, all that stuff is going on, and they're adapting to all these things at the same time. And I just don't think that my powers of pattern recognition, or really anybody's, are good enough to extract the patterns in that type of chaotic environment. So how do you start to figure this out? Well, I think you want to simplify things as much as possible. And that's really the upshot, is if you can simplify the training stimulus as much as possible, then you can start to see more clearly what some of these relationships turn out to be. So what we'll do in the beginning is we'll develop a training microcycle. For most people, that ends up being about a week long. So it's 1 week of training, and they'll do that week of training, and we'll monitor their results. And then we'll just repeat that. We don't change anything. We don't modulate the volume, intensity, exercise selection, or anything. The only thing that gets adjusted, the actual weight on the bar will get adjusted so that it fits the RPE, because we want that stimulus to remain constant. And then we're charting their results. How much are they improving? And as long as they're improving, we keep doing it. And then when they stop improving, then we kind of make a little bit more formal note of the observations that we can make. And then we'll change something and run another development cycle. Um, and over time, you start to develop a picture of what the athlete responds to. You can go back and look at these training blocks and say, every time we run a training block that is moderate intensity, and low in RPE, and we use these exercises or those intensities or anything like that, we get better results. And that's just correlative, right? Like, that's not a causal link. Like, you can't establish like a real causal link, but correlation's better than nothing. And so we look at it and say, okay, now you're training for this competition. This is the biggest competition of your year. So we're going to go back through your blocks and look at what's most core performances, most correlated to big jumps in progress. And we're going to basically replay a block that's kind of like your greatest hits. And that way you go into that competition. It's using the evidence of the athlete's training log to help inform these decisions that we're making, so that we have evidence of what this particular athlete responds best to. I think that's kind of how I would sum it up. And so you're letting the reason I'm calling it emerging strategies is you're letting the longer term plan emerge from these short term plans. Like, we will start out with a single microcycle that repeats, but as time goes on and you gain a better understanding of the type of microcycle that they need to use, then you kind of move up levels from there, and you say, well, it works even better, you know, development cycle B works the best, and it works even better if it's preceded by development cycle C. So if we run them in this sequence, then we get an even better result. So that's the idea, and that you would eventually get a longer and longer term plan that emerges from that short term plan, uh, knowing more clearly that this is something that the athlete really is responding best to. Now, of course, in real life, it gets thrown off quite a lot because you're not dealing with the same athlete every single training block. You're doing training with the hopes that the athlete develops, right? And this is lifting weights. So let's say that they add a bit more muscle mass. Well, now it's not exactly the same athlete. And oh, by the way, they're adapting in 1,000 different ways all at the same time. And you can't, I don't think that you can even necessarily track all the different ways that they're adapting, especially in a non-invasive, with the limitations that we have in a practical setting. You can't even account for all the adaptations. You just have to understand that they're not going, when you replay the greatest hits, it's not going to be exactly the same response as what you got the first time around. So you definitely have to continually refresh what you think you know about the situation as it continues to evolve. So that's, I think, as short as I can make the introduction to that.
So, Mike, one of the things that I got out of that is that training needs to be customized. So, we kind of start off with some basis of best practices of based on the information that we know about the athlete when we first start. This is the direction that we're heading in, and I think the difference for you is that the direction that you start is simply a microcycle, and that all of the information that you get from there onwards kind of influences that picture. But at the outset, I think the launching point is pretty similar from the direction that other coaches have, and that's just that training needs to be customized to the individual. People are different. We want something that works best for the individual.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's fairly common and well defensible, if that's a phrase, to say that training needs to be customized. And the thing that makes this different for me uh, is just that there's a more of a process around how to figure that out, and that it's not, you know, paying attention is definitely a critical factor in any sort of coaching. Uh, but I'll say that, like, I've coached myself since basically my second week in the gym. And I've learned things about my own responses to training by following this process uh, that I hadn't been able to observe any other way. Um, and I mean, at least for me, that the reason I'm using myself as an example here is, that I'm uh, motivated to find those sorts of things. So it's not really a lack of attention. It's just, it seems like it's been an effective way to reduce the noise and amplify that signal enough that I can actually see it, pick it up.
So this seems to me like it's a very data heavy way of analyzing training, Mike. Basically you would need to keep notes on every week, every session, and not just notes of what weights you used and what RPs they were, but generalized notes on how you're feeling and how your performance has changed. And let's say, how many times you repeat this microcycle and what the length of that mesocycle would end up as, and then how to kind of apply that in a broader picture, and kind of analyzing those and the sequences and things like that, and making those changes often enough that there's enough of a difference that you could see an appropriate pattern and have notes on it. So it seems to me that the fundamental basis for this working is actually extremely good note taking on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think it is definitely data heavy. And I think any sort of system that gets developed is going to have the biases of the person who developed it kind of baked in. So if you see in processes that we've used for coaching, even long before we started working on emerging strategies, um, we did things like we had a track system that would um, give us information on how the athlete's feeling every day. We were serious about training logs even before we had the website uh, training log applications and things like that. So I think that it's definitely, it makes sense, right? That this idea would be attractive to somebody like me, because we were already interested in these things. We were already doing a lot of these things, and then this idea comes along, and um, I think it's a good idea, and um, it also works out that we're already doing a lot of the things that we would need to make it. So I'm definitely with you on acknowledging the data heaviness of it.
Right.
But I think you could do it in a somewhat less data driven, not less data driven way, but like a less like I suppose a more qualitative way.
Like emerging strategies
Uh,
light.
well, sort of. Um, so this idea isn't just my idea. The origins of this, like, if we go back, I don't know if you guys are familiar with a guy named Matt Perryman. Um, he was a writer, I guess, a fitness writer. I'm sure that's not a. I'm sure he wouldn't be satisfied with
He wouldn't
that.
take kindly to that, but yeah.
No, no offense, Matt, wherever you are. But anyway, he wrote a lot. He was definitely more on the philosophical side of things. And one of the things he wrote was a book called Squat Every Day. I read that book and thought it was really excellent, not so much about the program itself, but the way that he thinks about training. And I remember that there was a section in that book where he talks about periodization as a concept is this top-down structure. You start with the big plan, and then you work your way down, and you know what you're doing in today's training session because that's one small building block that leads you to the bigger plan, right? And that's the general structure of periodization. And he makes a good case in that book for a bottom up planning approach. And I thought, well, that's really cool, but how would you do that? What would that look like? And I didn't really have a good answer for that. And time went on for a couple years, I guess. And I was listening to a podcast with Derek Evely, and Derek is a track coach in Canada, and he worked under Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk, who's one of the most prominent throws coaches um, in history. Um, I guess Dr. Bondarchuk, well, he used to be a Soviet hammer throw coach. He moved to, I think it was Kuwait for a while, and then ended up in Canada. Derek Evely worked under Bondarchuk for a couple years. And in this podcast, he was talking about the methodologies that he learned and began using under Dr. Bondarchuk. And it's very different from what was written than what the understanding that I gained from reading Bondarchuk's books, and he addresses that in a few of the podcasts and stuff that he talks about. But anyway, his podcast was the first one that I heard of that's like, I was listening to it and I thought, that's a bottom up system. That's what a bottom up system would look like if you were to implement it. And so I worked on how would I apply that to powerlifting. So that's kind of the background on kind of where the idea comes from. Now, the reason I bring that up is that I don't think that when Bondarchuk was coaching people in person, that it was quite as data heavy as the system that I'm implementing now. It was data heavy in the sense that they were definitely measuring and tracking uh, throw performance for the competition lifts in every session. But I don't know that they cared that much about, uh, the RPEs on your snatch work or anything like that. I don't think they cared so much about that. Um, and truth be told, I don't know. That only makes a difference in my implementation uh, once we get to a certain level. I would say for 75% of the people I coach, we don't really get down to what was your RPE on those RDLs. It's useful to have in case we need it, but if we don't have it into the world, but that competition lift performance, that is essential. In fact, if we don't have it, then we can't really use this strategy.
I had a question
So you're
relating back to something you said in the introduction. How do you
Sure.
address the risk of diminishing returns when you're basing your training off of previous successes? So you're trying to kind of combine variables that you've had success with in the past. So how do you address the risk of the diminishing returns with that?
That's a really excellent question, actually. I don't really have a process or like a procedural way to address it. It's more of a by feel thing. And it's something that we've come up with more recently is that we've got lifters that we feel like we know this works. Every time we do pin squats, your squat goes up, or something like that. And then one time we'll do a cycle with pin squats and it doesn't. And you think, well, that's weird. Um, it could be that, it's just not a causal variable, but it also could be what you're talking about, just diminishing returns. And we see it more often when we come back uh, to that exercise or whatever that factor is more often. It seems to be a time component as well. So say you've got somebody who peaks in 4 weeks. So they're going to be doing 4 week blocks with like a 1 week transition between them. So the overall pattern is going to be about 5 weeks long, which is not very long really in the grand scheme of things. So say you take an exercise like pin squats and they respond really well to it, and then you do another development cycle that's got something different, and then you come back to pin squats. So it's really only been 5 weeks, 6 weeks since you've done that movement. That's not very long. It's not it's not long enough, like your body forgets what we're trying to do here, so I do think that there's more diminishing returns in a situation like that. If you've got an athlete that's takes 8 weeks to peak, there's going to be a 2 or 3 week transition between blocks. That's a lot longer period of time. In that case, you can do every other block and it's still like 3 months apart, which is, I think, a much better situation. But still, you want to be careful about coming back to the same stimulus too often. And so I'll say a little heresy at this point. This is something that um, I've gained an appreciation for one of the stories that Louis Simmons always told in his articles, um, about the Dynamo Club, and how all they did this experiment, and the upshot was that all at the end of the experiment, all the guys at the club wanted more variations in their program, more exercises, more changes. I think I understand that a bit better now. It's not necessarily that you want to. It's the change itself is a stimulus, but if you don't have enough options, then you're kind of left repeating the same stimulus maybe too frequently. So having more options allows you to use the variation when you need it. One way that I've addressed that more recently is, I don't know if you've seen more of my athletes doing tempo work, because that's a way to get us away from doing the same weakness correction type exercises that have made up the bread and butter of our programs for a long time. The thing is that was always there. We were probably always getting that effect, that diminishing returns effect. It's just that I never noticed it before because I couldn't see that pattern. So
My thinking would be it might be difficult to pinpoint which variables are causing things to stall out, whether it's exercise selection or total volume. How do you
yeah,
kind of choose which variables to adjust and figure out how to go forward from there?
I think of it kind of in a. I've taken the calling it a Bayesian approach. I'm not really trained in statistics, so I could be misusing the term. But I have kind of an intuitive process for that. Like I look at their training record and I see, well, you responded well to floor press. So I wonder if you would also respond well to a two board press. You know, I I think I've noticed some of these patterns over time, and we could make more formal observations of some of these patterns. Through a training log analysis, and that's something that I definitely want to do in the future. But if I notice that, then I'll say, well, we have this training block. It's not necessarily close to anything that we're really training for, so we can use it to explore. Um, so we'll include more of these stimuli that we maybe haven't done recently or maybe haven't done ever. Something that I like to talk to the athlete too and see if they have any sort of intuitive leanings. Like, man, I just really feel like triples would be good right now. Like I place a lot of value on that. I think of it kind of like, if you've been working outside all day and doing some manual labor, sweating all day, and you get back in, finish up at the end of the day, and you're really craving salty food, that your body is craving salt because you've expended all this salt, right? That maybe there's some small thing that causes you to want to do triples, and like it's it's as good an idea as anything else, unless of course you can look back at your training log and see, well, every time we do triples it's a disaster. Then maybe you want to ignore that impulse, right? But in the absence of something like that, then I like to use an intuitive approach, figure out what the athlete wants to do, and definitely include things that you've seen. If you notice that they have such and such a movement pattern deficiency or something like that, and you notice that other times doing this kind of training or that kind of training corrects the deficiency, then definitely lean on your own knowledge. Um, but a lot of it seems to be kind of an intuitive process.
I think that's an often neglected aspect in training, and I'm sure I've mentioned this in other podcasts we've done. What the athlete wants to do, and there's so much weight to that. Whether or not it's the actual superior training methodology at the moment, being excited about what you're doing goes a huge way towards getting more out of it, because you're just going to give it that enthusiasm. You're going to go into each session individually motivated, and it's all going to be internal, and that internal motivation just has so much more value and end effect than simply being told by someone else, oh, this is going to be a great training block, whereas inside your head you're like, oh no, this is going to be a great training block. Those are two extremely different ends of the spectrum when it comes to motivation.
Yeah.
And or no, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I listened to you guys, your podcast with John Kiley, which was excellent, by the way. And he spoke at length about the value that should be placed on athlete buy-in. And I think that's a great way to get athlete buy-in. The athlete's telling you, hey, I think doing triples is going to be good for me. And you say, nah, you know, they go, oh man, well, I mean, if you have a good reason, of course, that's your job as a coach. But if you don't have a good reason, then if you can lean that way a little bit, then that's a great way to get the athlete buy-in, and it's probably going to be more effective because you've got the athlete buy-in.
Note note to coaches out there, like, this isn't just kind of going with whatever direction the wind blows in terms of what athletes want. They hire us for reasons that, we are expected to lead them in better directions. And I think athletes can sometimes be led astray by their favorite athlete doing such and such exercise, or when the kind of grass is greener effect. When things are heavy, they want to be doing lighter, and when things are lighter, they want to going heavier. But yeah, I mean, I think there's value there, but I just had to put that in, that little caveat.
Sure, it's definitely a fine line to walk, right? Like you don't give them everything that they want. Your job is to provide guidance, but there's how can I say what I'm thinking? It's like if you were standing at one end of a swamp, and you've got to cross to the other end of the swamp. Now, there's multiple pathways through the swamp, and a lot of them interconnect and stuff like that. Which one's the best? Well, the one that gets you to the other side is the best, So if the athlete kind of wants to go this way and you don't see any reason not to, then maybe that's a fine way to go. Now, if you go, hey, there's definitely an alligator there, go the other direction, so that you've got to be the guide, but not the tyrannical ruler,
To add something there, box squats are that alligator, just so box squats with bands or any form of accommodating resistance are that alligator. Mike told us this before we got on the call. I want to throw a hypothetical at you, Mike, and this is something I actually posted as a poll on Instagram yesterday, and it's an interesting concept to me. Let's say you were coaching an athlete, a new athlete. You don't have a lot of backlog data on this person. You've been coaching them for 8 weeks, and they are currently 4 weeks out from a competition and just finished a cycle, and it's been the best results they've had ever in training. And let's say this is a moderately advanced athlete, so a 200-pound male that can squat about 550, can bench around 380, and can deadlift around 600 plus. And you just finished that cycle, and they put 25 pounds on all three of their estimated maxes. What do you do in that situation? Are you going to repeat that cycle to lead them into their competition? Are you going to make substantial changes? Are you going to repeat the initial development cycle? And I don't want an "it depends" answer. I want because I saw that I saw the eye forming on your lips, but it's because I mean, and obviously it does depend, and I'm not ignoring that by any means, because we can get into the longer answer after the shorter answer. But given the scenario that you're in, you created this 8 weeks of training, and as I observed is kind of common in the way that you create training protocols, there's no rep range that is wholly based on your proximity to competitions. So let's say they were doing sixes in this second development block and things were going extremely well. What are you going to do with that person leading into those last 4 weeks?
I would change it. I think I would have to change it, because if we've ended the development cycle at that point, then there's a reason. And the reason would be that continuing with that stimulus is going to, we've seen the peak of adaptation to that stimulus. If we keep going with the same thing, we're going to get kind of a declining result. So I would definitely change it. As far as how much to change it, man, like that's a question that actually has in real life led to a lot of hand wringing, and those are hard questions for me to answer because I've honestly been in a lot of those situations. I'll pick up an athlete and they're like, "Hey, I'm training for Worlds in 12 weeks," and I'm like, "Oh, yippee!" Like on one hand, it's great to like I love working with people like that, but that's such a short timeline. It doesn't seem short, but it really is short. Um, so yeah, I mean, you go, well, I don't really know, and it's more than that. It's like I can't know. The information isn't there for you to make an informed decision. So you're making an intuitive decision. You're making your best guess based on your previous experience. Um, you talk to the athlete and figure out, what are they feeling? What are their intuitions saying? But just kind of off the cuff, based on what you said, I think I would change it. I I would change it probably not as much as I would change it normally. I would, unless I had a good reason not to, I would probably increase the intensity on the competition lift uh, in an as planned fashion. Um, but I would try to keep some elements of uh, the assistants or secondary slots or however you want to term it, the other work, the work that's not the heaviest competition lifts of the week. I would make some changes there.
See, and I think that's a fair answer on your part because a background detail here that differs how you create your training cycles from how a lot of coaches create their training cycles is that your macro cycle, or excuse me, mesocycle length is determined by when performance stops increasing.
Yeah.
And that's a critical difference between how a lot of people program. It's and I find myself oftentimes just mentally falling into the 4 week block length, and which works, right? You could develop someone for 4 weeks, and maybe you're just leaving 1 or 2 weeks on the table. Maybe you went a week too long. So based on the fact that performance stopped going up, obviously you're not going to just repeat what you were just doing, because then you're kind of banging your head against the wall. So some changes need to be made in that case. So I think in me asking you that question, it was a little bit loaded because there was only one way for you to answer it. Now that I think about it. Now that I think
Well,
about it, that's true.
honestly, it's a real situation that has definitely come up, and it really does lead to some frustration because I like for there to be right answers, or at least justifiable answers, and in that question you kind of go, whatever you think, there's a lot of answers that you could justify, and I tend not to like that as much, but no one cares what you like. You've still got to come up with some training for that athlete to do.
Uh,
So,
Mike, I think we glossed over something that's actually a pretty big difference between the way that you program and the way that a lot of other coaches program, or that is seen kind of commonly in powerlifting and strength sports generally, and that's that periodization in the more traditional ways is a little bit of a lie in that you just don't have the level of predictability that people think that you have when it comes to expected outcomes or timelines of a type of response that you're getting. And you essentially threw out the whole model and started over from scratch of just let me just start with a specific microcycle and then take things from there as they come to me. And that's a big difference that you see. There are no fixed mesocycle lengths. There are no, here's your 8-week lead-in, here's your 12-week lead-in. This is the amount of time we have if there's a competition on the table, or if there's not, it's just massively more freeform as well. Am I getting that right?
yeah, I think at the more developed, like at a more developed level, definitely. I've definitely sent people in the competition haven't done nothing heavier than 6 reps at a 9 RPE, which is going to be 82% or something like that. Um, in a typical powerlifting program, you're definitely going to get heavier than that in your last 6 weeks leading into a meet. Um, but for him, that's what he responded well to, and more than that, if we went outside of that range, he responded poorly. He got worse and felt worse, and even to the point of getting injured. So I think at that level, it makes sense. But you still will have people, new athletes, that just start working with you, and you've got to have them do something. Um, and in my mind, the reason that, like, if we look at powerlifting history in particular, or strength training history more generally, this notion of gradually ramping up the intensity while you gradually decrease the volume is pretty ubiquitous. And I don't think it would be as ubiquitous as it is unless it was generally the right direction to go.
Mm-hmm.
So I do use that as kind of an idea that's in the background, you know. So say we get, like Hani was saying, a relatively new athlete that just starts to work with you, and let's say that we're able to figure out that they respond in 4 week blocks. So that first 4 weeks, you know, we're planning this competition period. So the second 4 weeks will be higher intensity than the first four, and the last 4 weeks will be higher intensity than the previous two. And you know, until we can establish what it is that they respond best to, we will go with kind of the default. You know, we'll go with what's uh, you know, with the general knowledge. You know, now if we had was that, then I think it would definitely be useful. I have tried to take some peeks into that with, you know, the personality stuff that we looked at. You know, how do lifters that have different personalities prefer to train differently, and they do, but we don't know yet if that's the most effective or just, you know, personality preferences, you know, kind of on display. We looked at uh, how effective is training at different intensities based on your performance of an 80% rep test. Um, so if you score high reps or low reps with an 80% rep test, does that mean that you should train one way or another? We looked at both of those things, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done there, but all that will do, even if we had a perfect picture, that just gives us an idea of a better starting point, so that hopefully there's a little bit less trial and error. Because with all of these things, like the 80% rep test, for example, that was a little bit more succinct. What we saw was that people who basically do better, you get better training results if you do what you're bad at. So if you scored low reps with 80%, then you got better training results doing high rep work. You scored high reps at 80%, you got better results doing low rep work. But the difference was small, and there were tons of exceptions, right? So how do you know if you're one of these exceptions or not? Well, you kind of don't until you start to look at the data and tease out how is your response different. But you know, it stacks the odds. No, then you know, here's an idea, a nudge in hopefully the right direction. So that's kind of how I've used that, and hopefully it gives us a little bit better starting point. But you know, that's about it, I think.
So as a fun tool for, let's say, compiling some of this data, you've recently made the RTS training log available for free to anyone on your website, right?
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
that's you know, having played with that a little bit, that is a pretty complex and pretty interesting to operate training log, because it gives you so much feedback on everything you're doing as you go, tracking all of your estimated maxes, showing you the change week over week, giving you an opportunity to take notes and keep all those things. And I actually think it's a fun training tool. It's a bit of a kind of a concerted effort to take things and put them directly in one by one, and so you kind of have to dedicate yourself to it. But for people who are interested in trying this out, and you know, maybe people who are gonna utilize the book that we're going to talk about in a minute, it ends up being a useful tool for training, or just to kind of examine what you're doing, right? And you know, this is one of the times when you can look at a bad training cycle as a success, right? It's like, oh, I won't do that again. You
Yeah.
walk away from it, and it's not wasted training. You didn't do nothing during that period. You certainly didn't regress most times. And if you have a temporary dip in actual or estimated 1 rep max, that's okay, because you can recover from that. All of the musculature and all of the nervous system that gave you that original previous max is all still there. You just possibly weren't primed for performance in the manner you needed to be. So it's a very interesting tool, and I think I don't know how many people are using it now that aren't RTS customers, but I'm certainly a fan of it, having played with it.
Well, thanks. Thanks. Yeah, it's something that we've definitely put a lot of work into. Um, I think that people log workouts for a lot of different reasons, and we definitely made this tool for people who are trying to get information back out of their training log. Like I have on my bookshelves behind me the training logs from like day one because I had heard to write it in the gym, but I can't use that data. Like it doesn't mean anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a documentation that some work was done. Um, the ideal to me has always been to how can we use this information to help us make better training decisions, put the right weight on the bar, lift it the right number of times. So the system that we've been building has been with that in mind. So I I know that it can be tedious to record every weight, reps, and RPE for every set and every exercise that you do, but when you go back and you can pull a block review, which is a report that we can generate that says, here was the training block that you did, and these were the results. This is how your body weight changed during that time. This is the character of that block, what exercises you did, what rep ranges that were trained, and volumes and stress levels and all this information, you know, and you can use that to make a better decision on what training block should you do next time. Or if you, it can be more simple than that. If you're in a workout today and you're saying, I need to do a set of 10 today, but I haven't done a set of 10 since the last time I did sets of 10 was 3 months ago. you know how valid is that data that's 3 months old? Well, maybe not. Well, you can use the workout planner tool that will look at the last time that you did this exercise, and whatever the rep range was, and make a recommendation for you for what weight you should use this time,
Mm-hmm.
based on the target reps and RPEs. So it's the idea is that it helps you put the right weight on the bar. It helps you make a better decision so that when you're actually there and in the gym, you do the things that you need to do so that you can progress faster, and that we can look at your data and figure out what block structure do you need, or what kind of other things do you need so that you can progress faster or more reliably or with less injury and things like that.
I wanted to throw out another hypothetical, if we could. Um, let's say you're taking on a new lifter for a 12-week cycle. Like you said, maybe a new lifter that wants to do worlds or something like that. And you take them through their training and they see some success with like a 10-pound increase on squat and deadlift and maybe 5 pounds on bench. How do you determine whether that's optimal progress for them at that point in their lifting career, or whether you need to make a bunch of changes to try to push for even bigger successes?
I would, I know I'm going to make changes. I'll, from one block to the next, I want there to be changes. Now, if, like in this example, we're getting pretty close to worlds, so it's hard to know whether or not those are good for that individual or not. With a bit more time, you develop a bit longer history, and you can see, like, hey, this was a 15-pound increase, but typically we only get 10, so that's good. Um, and you can kind of rank things that way. In the absence of that kind of data, well, you kind of don't know. You're kind of left based on the athlete's experience. And I think in terms of progression, a lot of times athletes, they know. If their bench has been stuck for a year, and they just put 5 pounds on it, then they're going to be happy about that, and you can take that as a positive indication. But if they've been progressing a lot faster than that, then they're not going to be happy with 5 pounds. So I think you can rely on the athlete's observation and just communicate with them because they're going to know a lot of that history until you've got enough records to establish a better history.
So let's talk a little bit about your upcoming book, Mike. You are, the reactive training manual, which that's the right name, right? It is called the
Yeah,
reactive training manual. The previous
yeah,
book is something I think we've all probably read at one point or another, and it's, in my opinion, one of the better pieces of literature out there available in terms of actual training that you can create, and you can read that and you could create your own training approach pretty much directly from it, where there's hundreds of publications that kind of give you this template and some surface overview of the ideas that that person has that actually aren't their own. And that's pretty much every powerlifting book from every big name powerlifter, with the exception of a few. So you are writing a book now on the principles and the ideas of emerging strategies. So kind of what can we expect from that?
um, I would like it to cover a range of things. Um, if I look back at the reactive training manual, the first book, which will be 10 years old this summer, um, I'm fairly happy with the way that I described some things in the book, like RPE, and some of those things have really withstood the test of time. Um, I didn't really get into more medium and long term planning in that book. I didn't feel like I had anything unique to say about it. I was still doing things that were very much in line with what I was reading about block periodization or other various models. And even some of my ideas on things like volume management or creating a microcycle and things like that. Those ideas have shifted and changed over time. So what I would like this book to be is um, kind of a more complete uh, thought, I guess, a more complete thought on um, where I'm at with training right now. So I want it to still cover things like RPE and the things that haven't changed, but also cover things like how are we doing volume management now, and this concept of emerging strategies, and uh, kind of do something similar. That's great feedback for me, by the way, that you feel that someone could read the reactive training manual and use it to create a plan. That's definitely the aim, and that's definitely the aim for this book as well. I want you to be able to read it and walk away and say, I can do emerging strategies. Like I can manage this myself, and at least start that process of kind of understanding uh, your own training response.
So kind of, I can collect data for the next 12 months and then create my own training.
Well, I mean, if you're like me and you've been writing all this stuff down for years, then you've got plenty of data there. It's just a matter of figuring out what it means. Um, which, I mean, some of it's going to be useful, some of it's not. Like I've been training for 21 years now, something like that, and the training that I did in my early career probably doesn't have that much weight on what I should be doing in my next training block. So, no need to go back that far, right? But uh, you start by making the best guess possible for what you should do next, and you do it and monitor your results. If you've got time, then you explore new territory. If you don't have time, then you go back and look at what you've learned and gather the vital information from that and make the best use of it possible.
It feels to me a little bit like an intuitive, almost scientific method like approach to training. It's,
It's kind of a
just
marriage between the two, I guess. And I'm glad to be talking to you guys about this today, honestly, because it's one of these things where, uh, like I mentioned this in the podcast that I did with Jacob Sipkin. Like I feel like I'm talking about this. It really seems like a good idea, um, but I'm not. I haven't yet talked to that many people who really want to challenge me on these ideas, which means either I haven't talked to the right people, or or maybe the idea is not that unique or something, and I'm looking for that feedback. So it's good for me to talk to you guys about this because I know that you guys do things a bit differently, and I know that you're all being very polite and everything today, which I appreciate. But even the hypotheticals and whatnot, it helps me to understand the weaknesses of my own idea. My own idea, like it's mine, but um, of this idea, it helps me to understand the weaknesses of it. And it's not complete. I can't imagine that it's finished, so it will need to be changed and modified. So that's very useful.
Um, I actually wanted to throw out two challenges to you and just kind of like get some conversation going about this stuff. But
Excellent.
before I do that, I wanted to say that I think it takes a tremendous amount of like self control to check your biases of the way that you think training ought to be done, and kind of go boldly in a new direction that is kind of counter to the way things have been done. And that strikes me as a hallmark of the way that you have operated since the beginning is let me simplify things as much as possible. Let me check my assumptions, start from a basis and kind of take things from there. So that's wonderful. And as a result, I think you've been able to bring a fantastic number of new ideas to the table. It objectively, if this ends up being a superior way to go, we should be able to see that in the results that people are getting. So more results for more people or faster progress for more people or something like that. And I'd be interested to see if we are able to see that or even how you would
Yeah,
know in the first place.
that's a really excellent question. How would you know? Um, I mean, I don't have. What you really would need to know is some sort of a data-driven answer, and I don't have that right now. What I do have is anecdote, which take that for what it's worth. A guy here, I already told you that I'm writing a book about it, so there's my commercial interest for anyone who's keeping track of such things. uh, Anecdotally, what I've noticed. So I told you a story about I listened to this podcast with Derek. Where it went from there is I thought this is a really cool idea. I reached out to him and I was gonna just see if I could hire him for a couple hours just to talk with him about this idea, see if I had it put together. But he would have none of it. But we did get on a phone call, and he was super generous with his time and knowledge and everything, and really helped me a lot start to put the pieces together. And so I thought, okay, I'm in this situation now where I feel like I know what it would look like to do this. Now we need to test it and see if it works. But I was getting ready for a meet. I was in like the last couple weeks to a month before a meet that I was doing. So I didn't want to experiment on it myself, but I was too excited to wait. Uh, so I called Liz Craven and Megan Hinchley, both Australian lifters who were world class lifters, both training for the world championships at the time. It was a little bit further out for them, and I explained this whole thing to them, which I don't even know that they uh, cared to listen to me all that much, but I mean, it's their training, so of course it's important to them. But a little bit, it's like, hey, coach, make a decision, all right, But I explained this to him, and I was like, look, we're gonna take a thing and we're gonna do it. We're gonna keep doing it as long as it works, and when it stops working, we're gonna do something different. That's a pretty easy sell, I think. you know, so for them, they were like, yeah, okay, we'll give it a try and see how it goes. And we tried it, and the first block that we did with them was fantastic, just far exceeded my expectations. And Liz, in particular, um, she had just come off of a kind of a prolonged hypertrophy block. She'd had a lot of competitions over the course of a year and was feeling a little bit burned out. So we planned this hypertrophy block, got her away from doing a lot of heavy weights and things like that. And this was her first block back. And I remember by like the third week, she was handling world record weights in training, and I'm getting nervous because I'm like, geez, how far does this go? Like, she just came back. Like, is this gonna blow up in my face? And I remember calling Derek and was like, hey man, should I pull the plug on this a little bit early? Like, we haven't seen that performance dip that would indicate change in the training block. But let's not get carried away here, right? And his response was like, obviously, don't do something that's going to hurt an athlete,
Mm-hmm.
obviously. But at the same time, you don't want to, it's a little bit like playing chicken, that you don't want to flinch too early, because this training that she's getting right now is rare and valuable.
Mm-hmm.
This training where you're handling world record weights like that, how often does that happen? So you have to ride the wave a little bit, but also don't let it go too far. So we ended up letting things go, and things continued to improve. And for that strategy, her peak, I was kind of freaking out around week 3. She ended up going to week 5, and then in week 6 we saw the performance dip that we were looking for. So then we changed things, and it was all fine.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember thinking that, okay, we're going to basically not change things during the development cycle. We're going to not use variation as a tool for stimulus. I thought that makes sense in a long-term view, that the strategic view of variation and data collection and stuff like that will get more successful cycles, but each cycle won't be. So it's a little bit of a sacrifice in the short term for the sake of the long term. But what we've noticed is that doesn't seem to be the case, especially when we're taking somebody and we put them on this type of approach. That first block, it's more the rule than the exception that they have a really great experience in that first block. And I can't really account for that, other than the fact that it's quite different to do the same thing over and over again when you're used to doing things different all the time.
In terms of kind of boots on the ground differences, you mentioned that one of the differences is that things don't change week to week and that you preserve the same microcycle. But are you still programming similar exercises and similar rep ranges as you had been before?
Yes, essentially, yeah.
Okay. And then in terms of the type of variation you were doing prior, how would things vary week to week as opposed to this new strategy?
We would alternate exercises a lot of times. We would definitely vary the volume and intensity. So each week would certainly not look like the week that came before.
Mm.
The only constant would have been the competition exercise. And of course, you're going to see the same exercises every second, third week or something like that. The same protocol is going to repeat. That same exercise and protocol combination is probably only going to repeat, once in a while. But you get a lot more small changes. This is like no small changes, and then for each development cycle, it's a big change.
Mm-hmm.
But to kind of go back to your question earlier about kind of the same exercises and volumes, intensities, in general, yeah, but that's another thing that I've noticed lately is that I want more options, and so like that's what I mentioned, like bringing in this. We're starting to bring in more options so that it goes back to overusing that same stimulus. If I want to be able to have bigger changes between training blocks, so that if you, like, I talk about a lot about the chest fall pattern in the squat.
Mm-hmm.
If you're one of these people that does the chest fall thing, I don't even need to hammer that same thing every training block. I should probably get away from that from time to time, because whether it's pin squats or safety bar squats or high bar squats, they're all kind of doing the same mechanic. And even though they're different, I don't think it's going to be exactly the same stimulus, but I think it's going to be a pretty similar stimulus, and that whole pathway could probably get overused.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think that we can kind of see a recurring pattern and just try the same tools more or less to try to beat that pattern. And if the tools that we think we have and are using aren't working, what else do we turn to? Because we don't have the tools we don't have. So I like the idea
Right.
of kind of having a wider tool set.
Yeah, I'm with you there. That makes sense.
One of the things that you mentioned in your talk on the online university was about nonlinearity. The idea that you can kind of run the similar training multiple times and see different results. That kind of like strikes at the core of predictability, the idea that we want to be able to say, like, okay, well, this stimulus leads to this outcome, therefore this stimulus will lead to a similar outcome in the future. That strikes me as a basis of training generally. And you mentioned earlier how you can't always expect that, like you can't always expect the same result or the same stimulus to lead to the same result. But in the concept of block reviews and stuff like that, aren't you also looking for patterns in data as well?
Yeah, yeah. So it's a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? Yeah. So I think that there's some, if training can't be random, otherwise it wouldn't, none of this would really matter, So it's not exactly random, but it's not perfectly predictable either. It lies in this weird in between state, So I think it's trying to get the recipe right in terms of how much predictability do we really have. Because I think if you overestimate it or underestimate it, it leads to some suboptimal decisions. So getting that recipe right, I think is the critical factor. I mean, of course, I think that I'm on the right track to that, but only time's going to tell, and I'm sure that I'm going to refine my own ideas, and you know, certainly reasonable minds are going to disagree with the positions that I'm taking here as well.
I do think that you're onto something too. That there are limits to predictability based on the fact that we have a messy biological system, the fact that things change over time as a pure matter of course, and really what we're looking for is Bayesian probabilities of how likely can we expect what worked in the past to work in the future. And I'm 1,000% with you as far as that goes, and whatever strategies we can do to get there.
Well, just to add a little bit more detail to that, because I used that term earlier as well. What I mean by that is if you do one training cycle, we're definitely changing more than one thing from block to block, so that it's not like this tightly controlled experiment that you're running. And even if you did only change one thing, it still wouldn't help. Because your biological system is going to be different from block to block as well. So feel free to change multiple things, try different things. But as part of the record keeping, I want to see, every time that I've done pin squats, and if, 75% of the time I do pin squats, it leads to a positive outcome, then that's starting to paint a better picture.
Mm-hmm.
It's never going to be perfectly clear. It's never going to be perfectly certain. That's just the situation that we're in. To act like it's clear or certain is just deception. It's just never going to be that.
Mm-hmm.
But by looking at the data in this way, you can gain a bit more certainty with time, and that's what I mean when I'm saying. When I bring up Bayes really in this context in any way.
I want to say the one thing that I really applaud is, like, in terms of the rejection of periodization, the one thing that I've been just very frustrated about is like the only determinant for microcycle length is the fact that we happen to have a calendar with 7 days on it, and that it's convenient to write it down because it repeats. And that always struck me as, why am I doing this? Because it's easy to write and it's easy to structure, and it has nothing to do with biology or how long it takes to adapt to a stimulus or anything like that.
Yeah. Bondarchuk didn't do that. Now they're in a much different situation than we are for powerlifting, right? Because they have one skill that they're trying to get really efficient with, say the hammer throw, and he would build. So he's got his classification system for classifying movements. He's got competition exercise, which is pretty self-explanatory. I'm hoping, and he's got special developmental exercises, which are closely related, but not exactly the same. Special preparatory exercises, which for hammer throw that would be like their weight room work. For us, it would be more like your supplemental exercises, your isolation stuff, and then general exercises, which are not really related, but same muscles or training general energy systems, things like that. Prehab work. So what he would do is he would develop a workout that included something from all four classifications in every workout, and then he would just repeat the same workout. So for him, a microcycle was one workout, and you're monitoring the number of exposures. So like we were talking about, what I do is monitoring how many weeks does it take you to peak. Really what we're looking at is how many exposures to a certain stimulus does it take you to peak.
Sure.
So if you were, and one thing that I do quite often is develop a training block that is 2 microcycles per week. So an easy way to think of that is an A workout and a B workout. And if you do 4 workouts a week, that's A, B, A, B. And if you do that, then you're doing 2 microcycles per week. So if you have somebody who does 1 microcycle per week and they peak in, let's say, 6 weeks, that's 6 exposures. So if you were to do 2 microcycles per week, they're still going to peak in roughly 6 exposures. It's just it'll only take you 3 weeks to get there. So what you were saying about the calendar and the 7-day week, totally makes sense to me. I guess Bondarchuk's way of managing that was to go with, 1 workout microcycles, and they would take them however many sessions it took them to peak. Now, it doesn't really make sense for powerlifting because it's like we have 3 disciplines. Are you going to squat, bench, and deadlift plus all your accessory work in one session and then do that session again anytime soon?
I mean, you could, but
You can talk to Dr. Zordos about that, and he'll be happy to write that program.
But yeah, so I think it's a totally valid. No, even the 2 microcycles per week way of doing things. In the past, I've still anchored it to the 7-day week because it makes it's too convenient to pass up, basically.
Yeah.
The slight efficiency gained by going to a 6-day week or something like that is not worth the headache, and for a lot of people, their schedule wouldn't allow it anyway. So but you definitely could. You could go on a 3-day rotation or something like that, and as long as you're mindful of the number of exposures, then it's probably a slightly more efficient way to do it.
Well, I think this is kind of similar to how you plan a peaking method when you're using something like daily maxing. It's, typically you're hitting it however many times per week, and you think of it in terms of number of weeks, but you could zoom out and it's still just number of exposures.
Yeah.
So if when you're performing a daily maximal repetition 3 times per week, it takes you 5 weeks to hit your peak, it probably took 15 exposures to a maximum level intensity. So you could probably shift that into a longer or shorter time frame and potentially still get the same effect.
Yeah. Well, and one thing kind of related to this that Derek has told me that they've used with hammer throwing with success is that, so the number of exposures for hammer throwing seems to be quite a bit more than for powerlifting. So I'm finding our number of exposures ranges from like 4 to 10, with probably 6 being the average.
10.
Yeah. So that could be like a 10-week block.
That's extremely boring.
It's also difficult to manage. There's plenty of reasons to get away from that. but I mean, nowadays I wouldn't just make them do a shorter block. I would increase the frequency. So if I would do the 2 frequencies per week thing, and at that point, 10-week blocks turns into a 5-week block, and that's much easier to manage. But if you know the number of exposures, one thing that they'll do is they'll start with the competition date and work backwards to figure out when they need to start the development cycle and stuff like that. So if you've got a competition that just pops up uh, and you don't have the time to do your normal thing, you can just do 2-a-day workouts for a little while, and that'll move you closer to that'll speed up the whole peaking process. Now, that's a different situation, right? Because hammer throwing is not the same. It doesn't have the same uh, fatigue levels on the body that powerlifting is going to have. But each sport is going to be a bit different in its tolerances at that point.
So going back to my daily maxing squat example, you could max your squat 3 times a day for 5 days, and on Friday night, you're gonna hit a new PR. Somebody try that and tell me how it goes.
Right.
But
definitely some operational limits to this, right?
I'm not doing that, but somebody try it.
But it's essentially, if I'm understanding right, the analogy of why am I so echoey? Sorry. There we go. The analogy of an accordion, that you can kind of stretch it out to be a certain length, or you can compress it, but it's still the same number of ridges or the same same accordion.
Yeah. No, so, I think that gets interesting, especially like if you think of it from, again, in powerlifting, we're pretty willing to look at things like muscle protein synthesis times and stuff like that. So those don't really stretch and shrink in the same way. So I think there are some limits to the idea, like you can't just, well, I've got a long time before this meet, so I'll only do one workout a week and expect that to work the same way. But there is a little bit of stretch and squish in the system,
Yeah.
All right. So I think I'm going to bring us to an end here, guys. We are at about a good episode length. So that being said, Mike, this is actually it's a fascinating training methodology in my mind because of the fact, and Bryce hit on this earlier, that we're all following the same basic set of principles, right? And even in this emerging strategies approach, at a very base level, if you look through a fogged piece of glass, you're following the same set of principles as well. But you're the first person in a while to have a real different approach, like an actual, not the same, not a different flavoring of the same ice cream type approach. And I actually, beyond whether or not it works, I just admire that you're kind of at the forefront of doing something different. You're like a more modern Louis Simmons almost, but not as good looking. And No. No, but it's the same thing. Just like however long ago it was, the release of the West Side Manual so greatly challenged the norm that everybody wanted to do it. And this is obviously a little bit less of do it because I say so than the West Side method was in the manual. But I like that it's pretty radically different from what people are used to doing. It's going to challenge some of the ideas, and for the people who can really read it and digest it and understand it, and maybe come away from this podcast with questions. I'm just excited to see where it goes. It's pretty cool to see you challenging the norm.
Oh, thanks. I'm excited to see where it goes as well. And I think it's worth mentioning that I've definitely got skin in the game on this one. Coaching people for a living and coaching people, kind of developing the focus that we've developed, working with people at the highest levels. Then, I mean, if it doesn't work, then it'll hurt me first, but from what I've seen, it's worth doing, so that's why we continue to do it. And that's like, I do it in my own training and hopefully we continue to learn and develop things as well, develop the ideas and like I said, they're not complete. So I want to continue to improve on them, discard them if they're not up to snuff, but definitely continue moving in the direction of more effective training.
If anything, Eric Helms kind of had these pyramid ideas of these are kind of the structure of what's important when it comes to broad structure of creating training approaches. But there's this whole range of other things that we really don't have a ranking of importance. Like, how important is linearity? How important is training strain and monotony, or the repeated bout effect, or things like this. We don't really have a way that these concepts interplay with each other. And if we find that those things maybe aren't as important as we previously thought, or we're able to say, hey, this is actually more important than this, some of those things can help the strength community greatly.
Yeah.
Sweet. So with that said, Mike, everyone can find you on social media at Mike Tuchscherer, which is, let me get this, Tuchscherer, right?
Yes, sir. Yes,
All
sir.
right, so there we go. You can just search Mike T, most people, and you'll probably find him. But I am at Hani TSA, only on Instagram. Bryce is at Bryce TSA, and Eric is at Eric_TSA. And thank you guys for listening to another episode of the Strength Athlete Podcast. One more quick shout out to our sponsor, SBD USA. They make it possible for us to make it possible for you. And with that, we are done.